I wasn't looking for a secret history of giants. I wasn't even looking for Tartaria. In fact, my journey began in a far more mundane place. A digital archive of 19th century municipal fire codes and early urban structural regulations. I was simply trying to understand the evolution of fire safety in mid-Victorian urban planning, specifically why certain massive structures from the 1870s and 1880s seemed to entirely lack the standard exit protocols and human-scale logistics we take for granted today. I spent weeks scrolling through high-resolution scans of brittle blueprints and sepia-toned photographs of cities that were supposedly just emerging from the mud. But as I studied these documents, I found myself stopping. My eyes kept catching on a specific, recurring discrepancy. Not a missing fire escape. Not a strange hydrant layout, but a number, a measurement. A sheer, undeniable physical height requirement for main entryways that completely defied every law of architectural economy I had ever been taught. I found myself staring at a set of blueprints for a forgotten, supposedly newly built administrative building in a city that, according to the official historical record, shouldn't have even had a paved road or a functioning lumber mill at the time. The architectural drawing, rendered in unsettling precision, specified a set of solid oak and bronze main doors that stood exactly 12 feet, 6 inches tall. I stared at the glowing screen of my monitor in the quiet of my office, my mind desperately trying to reconcile that massive height with the supposed historical context of the era. We are told, quite clearly by historians and biologists alike, that in the mid-1800s, the average human male stood roughly 5 feet, 6 inches tall. Why then would a struggling colonial outpost or a newly settled western city facing harsh winters and limited supplies expend the immense, almost incalculable resources required to forge, hang, and balance a door that was more than double the height of its very occupants? Look at the photos on your screen right now. Truly look at them. I began to search the municipal archives for images of these doors in the real world. And once you start looking, the pattern repeats everywhere. Zoom in on this archival photograph of a local post office in a small Midwestern town, taken around 1895. Notice the solitary man standing on the stone steps. He is wearing a bowler hat and a heavy wool coat. He is a ghost of our official history, a man just trying to mail a letter in a newly settled town. Now look past him. Look at the door behind him. Look at the brass handle, the intricate, impossibly heavy cast iron filigree, the massive reinforced hinges. The handle isn't at waist height, where the biomechanics of a 5'6" human would require it to be. It sits level with his chest, perhaps even higher. To open that door, he would have to reach up, awkwardly straining his shoulder and fighting hundreds of pounds of leverage just to turn the latch and pull. The official explanation for this is always the same. It is simple, neat, and contained, designed to stop you from asking further questions. They tell us it was grandeur. They tell us it was aesthetic aspiration. Mainstream historians claim that these massive entryways were designed to symbolize the loftiness of the institutions they housed, banks, courts, and libraries. It was purely psychological, they say, a way to make the common citizen feel small and insignificant in the presence of the law or the state. It's a convenient narrative. It's an explanation that requires no further investigation. It's a bedtime story designed to keep you from asking the one fundamental question that destroys the entire facade. If these doors were built for us, for the struggling 5-foot-tall humans of the 19th century, then why did the architects systematically violate the most fundamental rule of engineering, the rule of efficiency? In a world of horses and wagons, where every single pound of material had to be quarried, cut, hauled by muscle, sweat, and beasts of burden over unpaved muddy roads, why would you waste thousands of pounds of rare hardwoods and smelted iron on a door that creates a massive heat loss problem, a structural sagging risk, and a sheer logistical nightmare just to open. If it were just about grandeur, you would build a normal, human-sized door and place a grand, ornate archway above it. That is how we build today when we want to look impressive without sacrificing function. But that isn't what we see in the old world. We see perfectly functional, immensely heavy swinging doors where the entire 12-foot slab of wood and metal is designed to move on hinges that exhibit a surgical precision. When you see a 12-foot door with a 6-foot handle, your own eyes are telling you a truth that the history books are desperately trying to overwrite. A door is not just art, a door is a tool. A tool is designed for the hand and the body that uses it. If the tool doesn't fit the hand, the tool wasn't made for that hand. We are told these imposing buildings were newly constructed by rugged pioneers who were barely surviving on the frontier, fighting cholera and the elements. Yet we are expected to believe these same pioneers spent their precious, limited calories and funds building functional entryways for beings twice their size. The logic bomb is simple, and its implications are staggering. Architecture follows the occupant. If the architecture is built for giants, the occupants were giants. The official narrative strains under the weight of its own mathematical contradictions. They want us to believe in a fantasy world of artistic excess to explain away a stark physical impossibility. But once you see the true scale, once you realize that the handles, the steps, the heavy bronze knockers, and the vaulted ceilings all speak of a completely different biology, you realize we aren't the original builders. We are the inheritors. We are the second-hand tenants living in a grand mansion built for a master who has been systematically erased from the timeline. If you are finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe to keep this research alive. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Have you noticed these anomalies in your own streets? When we strip away the romanticized paintings of pioneer resilience and look at these grand edifices through the cold, unforgiving lens of material science and logistical engineering, the official narrative begins to fundamentally fracture. Let us approach this not as historians accepting a given textbook, but as auditors of physical reality. Let us examine the sheer mathematical contradiction of constructing 12-foot-tall, solid hardwood doors in the mid-19th century, in cities that were, according to the official record, barely rising out of the mud. Consider the raw physics of the object itself. We are not talking about a thin, hollow-core veneer. The doors documented in these archival photographs and surviving municipal buildings are solid, old-growth timber, usually oak, mahogany, or walnut. A single slab of solid oak measuring 12 feet high, 6 feet wide, and 3 to 4 inches thick carries a staggering mass. When you factor in the density of the wood and the moisture content necessary to prevent catastrophic splitting, you are looking at an object that weighs well over 1,000 pounds. Now add the ornamental hardware. These doors are never bare. They are clad in heavy bronze kickplates, adorned with massive cast-iron scrollwork, and fitted with lock sets that weigh more than a modern car engine. A single completed door leaf could easily exceed 2,000 pounds. If we accept the official history, we must accept that architects working with severely limited budgets, entirely reliant on a human-sized workforce, with Spayminzestation-sized, consciously chose to multiply their labor and costs by an order of magnitude. Every decision on a frontier construction site is governed by the brutal realities of resource management. How do you transport a 2,000-pound, 12-foot slab of flawlessly finished mahogany on a wooden cart pulled by draft horses over unpaved, rutted dirt roads without shattering it? The coordination problem of merely moving these objects from a distant, hypothetical mill to a muddy construction site is staggering. Yet we are told they did this not just once, but tens of thousands of times. In countless cities across the realm, purely for aesthetic aspiration. The math doesn't add up. The energy expenditure is a mathematical contradiction to the desperate survival-focused needs of the pioneers we are told inhabited these spaces. But the impossibility goes far beyond mere transportation. Look closely at the joinery. Look at the way these massive slabs of wood meet the stone archways. Hanging a door of that immense weight requires hinges that defy the supposed technological limitations of the era. If you have ever tried to hang a standard, modern solid core door, you know that even a fraction of a millimeter of misalignment will cause the door to bind, scrape, or fail to latch. Now multiply that weight by 20. The hinges required to carry a 12-foot, 2,000-pound door must be seated deep into the surrounding masonry with surgical precision. The pins must be forged from advanced metallurgical alloys to prevent shearing under the constant swinging load. If these structures were truly built by men using crude hand-cranked drills, primitive chisels, and plumb bobs, we should see the wobbles of human error. We should see deep gouges, irregular gaps, and doors that have sagged heavily against their frames over the decades. Instead, we see a mechanical perfection that hints at something entirely different. We see hinges that have not sagged a single fraction of an inch in over a century and a half. We see doors that, despite their crushing weight, can be pushed open with the gentle press of a single finger. This is not the hallmark of men struggling with rudimentary tools in the dirt. This is factory-level output. This is evidence of antiquitech, the lost machining capabilities of a superior civilization that possessed an intimate understanding of load-bearing mechanics and advanced metallurgy. Furthermore, we must address the glaring biological contradiction of thermodynamics. The 19th century was famously cold. Heating was a matter of life and death, reliant on burning wood or coal in small, localized fireplaces. Why would a society, supposedly building from scratch in freezing climates like Chicago or St. Petersburg, deliberately construct entryways that create a massive heat loss problem? A 12-foot door creates a gaping thermal wound in a building. Every time it is opened, the massive displacement of air instantly drains the heat from the interior. No rational engineer builds a doorway that requires 300% more material than necessary and actively works against the survival of the occupants, unless there is a biological, functional requirement to do so. If the architecture dictates that the door must be 12 feet high to accommodate the people walking through it, then the thermodynamics become a secondary concern to the sheer physical necessity of entry. Architecture follows the occupant. This is where the inheritance theory becomes not just plausible, but mathematically and logically unavoidable. The evidence etched into the very stone and wood of our cities suggests that we did not build this world. We found it. We are akin to caranguejos eremitas, hermit crabs, wandering through the aftermath of a catastrophe, moving into the discarded, magnificent shells of a much grander, much larger civilization. We stumbled into these cities when they were already standing, their towering doorways and copper domes reaching into the sky, and we simply occupied them. Because our human frames were too small, we adapted the ruins to our degraded state. We couldn't reach the original door handles, so we bolted new, cheaper latches near the bottom. The massive, echoing halls were too cold to heat with our primitive stoves, so we dropped the ceilings, boarded up the towering transoms, and divided the grand spaces into claustrophobic human boxes. The 12-foot door is not a statement of Victorian style. It is a tragic fossil. It is the lingering footprint of a biology that was systematically erased from the timeline. We are living in the ruins of a global society that operated on a scale we can barely fathom. And every time you walk through an oversized door, you are stepping through the ghost of a giant. If these staggering architectural anomalies were confined to a single geographic location, if we only found these impossibly massive 12-foot doors in the opulent financial districts of London or the oldest boulevards of Paris, we might be able to force ourselves to accept the official narrative. We might be able to convince ourselves that a specific localized culture, perhaps possessed by a fleeting madness of aesthetic grandeur, temporarily abandoned all logistical reason to build monuments for a human scale that did not exist. But as we pull back the lens and examine the wider archival record, that localized comfort completely evaporates. The pattern repeats, and it repeats with a surgical precision that shatters the fragile timeline we have been taught to believe. Let us take a slow, forensic tour through the sepia-toned photographic archives of the late 19th century. We begin in Chicago, a city supposedly built rapidly from the muddy shores of Lake Michigan. Look at the early photographs of its post-fire administrative buildings. There they are, the towering, heavily ornamented doors, framed by colossal Greco-Roman columns that dwarf the horse-drawn carriages passing beneath them. Now, let us cross the ocean to Melbourne, Australia. According to the history books, Melbourne in the mid-1800s was a rough, newly established gold rush town at the edge of the known world. Yet the archival photographs of its parliamentary and municipal buildings from the 1880s reveal the exact same architectural language. We see the same perfectly cut masonry, the same staggering proportions, and the very same 12-foot doors hanging on unyielding iron hinges. The visual dissonance does not stop at the borders of the British Empire. We find identical structures standing in the center of Buenos Aires, Argentina. We find them in the administrative centers of Calcutta, India. We find them staring out across the plazas of St. Petersburg, Russia, and lining the oldest avenues of Cape Town, South Africa. It is a global phenomenon. We are looking at a unified, standardized architectural grid that entirely ignored local climate, local available materials, and, most importantly, local human height. How did disparate populations of struggling pioneer settlers, situated on opposite ends of the earth and separated by vast oceans and months of treacherous, disease-ridden sea travel, independently arrive at the exact same mathematical contradiction for their entryways? The official record would have us believe that architectural fashion moved faster than the telegraph, compelling architects in mud-covered colonial outposts to bankrupt their young cities just to build grand entrances for giants they had never met. They ask us to believe in a simultaneous, parallel evolution of irrational excess. But when you look at the sheer weight of the stone, the complex metallurgy of the hardware, and the impossible logistics of the shipping routes required to achieve this in the 1800s, the official explanation collapses. When you chart these identical massive doors on a map, the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. In the era of the horse and cart, you cannot globally coordinate the quarrying of millions of tons of identical limestone, the casting of identical massive bronze hardware, and the implementation of identical non-human proportions without a unified pre-existing global infrastructure. If the official timeline of the 19th century is true, this global synchronicity is not just unlikely, it is a physical and mathematical impossibility. The existence of a giant population is not a localized myth. It is a biological requirement to explain the global footprint of this architecture. These towering doors are never found in isolation. They are always part of a specific technological package. Where you find the 12-foot doors, you inevitably find the intricate copper domes, the vaulted ceilings, and the towering spires that operated not as mere decoration, but as functional atmospheric energy antennas. It is a cohesive, standardized system of antiquitech built by a singular, advanced global civilization, a civilization frequently labeled on pre-1800 maps as Tartaria. To further understand the scale of what we are looking at, we must look down. Notice how often these global structures with their giant entryways also feature fundições ocultas, underground levels, where fully formed windows and sometimes even secondary doors sit at, or below, the level of the sidewalk. The official narrative hastily dismisses these as light wells or basement ventilation. But if you apply the logic of the giant, a much more unsettling picture emerges. The street level we walk on today is not the original street level. These buildings were subjected to a global terraforming event, a massive inundation of earth and sludge, often referred to as the mud flood. If the current streets are sitting several feet above the original foundations, then the 12-foot doors we see today might only be the upper portions of entryways that were once even larger. Or conversely, the doors are perfectly situated for a ground floor that was built for beings of immense stature, and our modern raised streets merely allow us to reach the bottom edge of their handles. When you look at the high-resolution 19th century photographs, the visual contrast is a silent confession. You see small, weary humans in ill-fitting clothes standing in muddy, unpaved streets, dwarfed by pristine, colossal architecture. They do not look like the proud builders of a new age. They look like refugees, wandering bewildered through the silent, empty cities of a fallen empire. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The global repetition of these massive doors is not proof of a shared Victorian aesthetic. It is proof of a shared, stolen inheritance. It proves that a unified civilization existed, that they operated on a biological scale far grander than our own, and that their cities spanned the entire Earth before the narrative was reset. We did not build this world simultaneously in the 1800s. We simply mapped it, claimed it, and changed the locks on doors we could barely reach. If we accept the mathematical impossibility of our human ancestors building these 12-foot doorways, the immediate rational question becomes, where did the original builders go? And more importantly, how do you completely erase a global population of giants and their corresponding history from the official record? To answer this, we must look not at what is written in the textbooks, but what is conspicuously missing from the archives. When you analyze the genealogical dead ends, the burned census records, and the destroyed municipal ledgers, a deeply unsettling hypothesis emerges, a 19th century reset window occurring roughly between 1850 and 1920. This was not an era of romantic pioneer building, as the narrative insists. It was an era of clearing. It was a period of inexplicable demographic shifts where millions of adults vanished, and history was quite literally rewritten to fit a new, smaller, and more easily managed human population. Consider the systematic destruction of the written record. We are told that countless libraries burned, that pre-1800 books were lost to time or neglect, and that families migrating across the world simply changed their names at borders. But when viewed through the lens of a global cover-up, this is the severing of the umbilical cord to the Tartarian past. When you approach the major historical institutions, the museums, the architectural societies, the university archives, and you ask to see the original, unedited logistical ledgers for the construction of these colossal buildings with their oversized entryways, you are met with bureaucratic walls. You ask for the foundry receipts for a set of 2,000-pound bronze hinges in a town that didn't have a metal press, and the academic historians offer only vague platitudes about unrecorded civic pride. The silence is deafening. It is the silence of an active institutional cover-up, a void carefully constructed to hide a biological truth. But paper is easy to burn. Giant stone, iron, and old-growth mahogany architecture is not. You cannot simply sweep a 12-foot, perfectly balanced, functional doorway under the rug. To hide the colossal scale of the previous world, you must physically destroy the evidence that contradicts your new human timeline. Enter the great urban fires of the late 19th century. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, San Francisco, Baltimore. The list is mathematically improbable. We are taught that these were tragic accidents caused by kicking cows, dry winds, or careless transients. But look at the archival photographs of the aftermath. These were not wooden shanty towns that burned. We see massive, block-long edifices of granite, limestone, and iron reduced to powdered ash and warped, melted metal. The thermodynamic energy required to melt a cast iron facade and shatter quarried stone blocks does not come from a wooden barn fire. These fires acted with surgical precision, clearing out the most glaring examples of the oversized inherited Tartarian infrastructure to make way for the cramped, human-scale, utilitarian architecture of the 20th century. Yet, some inherited cities were too magnificent, too sprawling, and too undeniable to simply burn without raising mass suspicion. How do you dismantle a massive, empty Tartarian metropolis sitting in the middle of a continent? You throw a party. You call it a World's Fair or a Universal Exposition. The official narrative of events like the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition or the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair is perhaps the greatest logistical fairy tale ever sold. We are asked to believe that laborers with horse-drawn carts built sprawling neoclassical cities of impossible scale, complete with illuminated copper domes and towering 12-foot doors, all in a matter of months. And then we are told, because it was all supposedly made of temporary plaster and hemp, they simply tore it all down or let it burn to the ground as soon as the fair ended. It is a logistical contradiction. You do not build functional canal systems and permanent rail lines for a temporary plaster exhibit. These fairs were not construction sites. They were demolition sites. They were the public executions of the old world, disguised as temporary celebrations of the new. For the oversized structures that somehow survived the fires, the fairs, and the Wreckers' Ball, a different kind of erasure was necessary. The physical mutilation of the architecture itself. We call it renovation. Look closely at the giant doors that still stand in our older financial districts and government centers. Notice how often a smaller, standard, human-sized rectangular door has been crudely cut directly into the bottom half of the original 12-foot wooden slab. We are told this is for energy efficiency or to keep out the draft, but it is, in reality, a biological retrofit. They lowered the towering ceilings with cheap drop tiles. They broke up the grand staircases that were designed for a much longer stride. They systematically altered the scale of the environment to force us to forget that it was never built for us in the first place. Every retrofitted door frame and every lowered ceiling is a psychological bandage placed over the gaping anomaly of our stolen history. When you stand in the shadow of a 12-foot door, you are not merely looking at an architectural anomaly. You are standing at the threshold of a stolen utopia. Imagine for a moment the world that required such staggering proportions. It was not a world of grueling, mud-soaked frontier survival, as the history books insistently dictate. A civilization that builds entryways of such breathtaking scale, balanced on frictionless hinges and framed by flawless masonry, is a civilization operating from a place of absolute, unmitigated abundance. We are told by the official narrative that our modern era is the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, that we have gloriously evolved from the darkness of the past into the bright, efficient light of the industrial and digital ages. Yet look around you. Look at the utilitarian concrete boxes we construct today. Look at the drywall, the synthetic carpets, the hollow core doors that barely muffle the sound of the traffic outside. We build for cheapness. We build for planned obsolescence. We live in gray, uninspired grids, paying exorbitant fees for metered electricity to heat cramped rooms that bring us no aesthetic joy. Now look back at the archival photographs of the old world. Look at the sweeping avenues, the copper-domed energy stations, the intricate stonework that turns a simple post office into a palace. Which society was truly advanced? Which society actually valued life? To walk through a 12-foot doorway is to step into a frequency of existence we have been biologically and culturally downgraded from. Imagine the acoustic resonance of those vaulted halls when they were filled with the people who actually fit them. The architecture was not designed to make us feel small. It was designed to harmonize perfectly with beings of a completely different stature and resonance. We walk through these inherited spaces today like children playing dress-up in their parents' clothes. We scurry across the vast marble floors, shivering in the drafts, marveling at ceilings we cannot reach and windows we cannot see out of without dragging over a footstool. The melancholy of it all is almost overwhelming when you finally realize what you are looking at. We were robbed. We were not just robbed of our true history, we were robbed of our inheritance. We were meant to live in a world of supreme beauty, a world where the very buildings we inhabited functioned as atmospheric healing centers and energy gatherers. Instead, we have been forced into a downgraded, degraded state of survival, told to be grateful for the cramped, mass-produced cages we are allowed to purchase with a lifetime of labor. This is why the realization is so deeply unsettling. It triggers a profound, visceral grief for a future we were supposed to have, and a past that was surgically cut from our collective memory. The institutions, the academics, the narrative keepers, they want you to look at a 12-foot door and feel a sense of distant, disconnected awe for the hard-working pioneers who supposedly built it. They want you to feel pride in a historical lie. But once the cognitive dissonance breaks, once you apply the cold, hard logic of engineering and biology to the physical evidence, that pride turns into a haunting sorrow. You realize that the aesthetic perfection of the old world was not an accident, and it was not a fleeting trend. It was the standard operating procedure of a global society that valued harmony, proportion, and a flourishing existence above all else. They erased the giants, and in doing so, they erased the ceiling of our own potential. They left us with the physical shells of Tartaria, stripped of their technology and their true context, to use as banks to indebt us, and courts to judge us. But the stone remembers. The iron remembers. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every time you walk down a historic street, every time you visit a state capitol or an old world library, you will feel the ghost of that lost scale. You will reach for a heavy brass handle positioned far too high for your shoulder, and you will know in the marrow of your bones that you are a stranger in your own history. You will never look at a building the same way again. The illusion of our modern supremacy shatters completely against the unyielding, 12-foot reality of the world we actually inherited. We have walked together through the dusty, neglected corners of the digital archives. We have examined the unforgiving metallurgical constraints of the 19th century, and we have looked closely at the brutal mathematics of thermodynamics, leverage, and structural load. The official narrative, curated by institutions that demand our blind faith, asks us to abandon our fundamental reason. It asks us to look at a 12-foot, 2,000-pound solid mahogany door, suspended flawlessly on frictionless, precision-machined iron hinges, and attribute its existence to the fleeting aesthetic whims of struggling, 5-foot-tall pioneers working with horse-drawn carts in the freezing mud of a new frontier. It is a story designed for children, a simple, comforting fable constructed to cover up a staggering biological and architectural theft. But we are no longer children, and the physical evidence of the old world refuses to remain entirely silent. We are the unwitting occupants of a stolen realm. We are the inheritors living in the hollowed-out, retrofitted shells of a civilization that operated on a scale of absolute abundance, acoustic harmony, and physical stature that we can barely comprehend today. The Tartarian giants, whether they were systematically eliminated by a coordinated cataclysm, buried by the suffocating deluge of the mud flood, or quietly scrubbed from the municipal ledgers of history by the architects of the Great Reset, left their undeniable fingerprints on every single continent. They left them in the impossible stonework, the towering copper-domed energy gatherers, and most glaringly, in the massive entryways that perpetually dwarf our modern human frames. We did not build these grand, echoing capitals, these magnificent basilicas, or these fortress-like financial centers. We simply moved in, lowered the ceilings, bolted new handles near the floor, and allowed the new institutions to rewrite the timeline of human achievement. But a profound, unsettling question remains, lingering in the cold drafts of these cavernous, inherited hallways. If the timeline was deliberately reset, and the original towering inhabitants were erased with such ruthless global coordination, who exactly orchestrated the clearing? Who possessed the logistical power to burn the old cities, stage the grand world's fairs as elaborate demolition sites, and force a unified, downgraded historical narrative onto an entire planet of survivors? If the giants were the tragic victims of this grand historical theft, who or what were the victors that claimed the keys to their empty palaces? The evidence is all around us, waiting for you to see it. If this video resonated with you, please like and share it to help break the algorithm's silence. Subscribe for the next part of the investigation. The truth is waiting.